Hey guys, I am John with the Parking Lot Rebels back again, telling you about the new stimulus relief packages and what you need to know. But before we get into it, let's take a word from our sponsor. Today's sponsor is the housing market. The housing market. Get it while it's still hot. So this last week, there was a lot of debate amongst lawmakers about the new omnibus spending package for the United States, as well as the COVID relief bill and the stimulus checks that go with it. So there's a few pieces in play here. At the high end of the advocacy for citizen money, you've got types like Bernie Sanders and Kamala Harris, who back in May, when everyone was still in election season, they were calling for $2,000 checks for stimulus relief for everybody. As a compromise to that, Joe Biden recently, as last month, was calling for $1,200 checks. Of course, at this point, Kamala Harris had pivoted and followed him up that alley. And as things were settling down to a $600 check, it was Donald Trump himself who espoused that what they were calling for was nothing short of what did he call it? A disgrace. And he himself said the people should get $2,000. Of course, this really shouldn't be a surprise. Donald Trump is known for just saying things as they occur to him, whether it's online or live. And him being a man without a specific political ideology is basically allowed to say whatever he wants. Whatever he thinks will play best to the crowd, that's kind of what he's going to throw his gauntlet down for. So with all the arguing going on about how much should be spent, there's a couple new economic ideas that are becoming part of the mainstream conversation. I think the biggest one right now is the national deficit, and is deficit spending good? Now, what deficit spending sounds like to most of us is that we are spending more at the federal level than we are taking in through tax revenue. And for most of us, it kind of sounds like irresponsible spending, but that's not necessarily the case. Some economists believe that the overspending of what we actually have, it allows for room for growth. It performs an incentive for people to hang on to their current currency. So for the American government, if they can overspend and with American bonds incentivize you to hang on to that, it makes their currency more valuable. That makes the U.S. dollar more valuable in general. You could think of deficit spending as a type of weightlifting, right? In weightlifting, you stress your system out in order to make gains in the future, strength and muscle gains. So government spending really came into question in the 20th century, and there's kind of two main events that led to the United States government getting off the gold standard. And what that means is that the US currency was not backed by tangible gold anymore, and it became more of an abstract idea. So this started first in 1933 when FDR made it illegal for creditors to collect just in gold. And then again in 1973, I think the U.S. officially came off the gold standard as Gerald Ford made the public allowed to own gold. So without the U.S. economy being tied to gold, it definitely became much more of an abstract, untied idea that leaves a lot of people nervous. So with gold no longer being part of the United States economy, what we now have is something called modern monetary theory. And this is described as a few different things by a few different people, but it's important to understand what it is and definitely what it is not. Our friends on the far left, our progressive types, they often use modern monetary theory as essentially an excuse to spend whatever we need to. Because federal governments have a monopoly on their own currency, again, the United States is the best example, they can print however much money they need because they have complete rights to it. Um, the far left will say that you can spend as much as you need to give everyone everything they need. Your Medicare for all, your open borders, your social safety nets, you can just go hog wild with that stuff and there'll be no consequences.
Finally, those capitalist pigs will pay for their crimes, eh? Hey, comrades, hey!
That's kind of an irresponsible view on modern monetary theory, and it's definitely what it isn't. Um, a more accurate way to describe it is essentially an economic theory that just acknowledges that our our currencies are essentially theoretical, right? Our digital currencies are mostly through online spreadsheets and numbers on your screen more than they're tied to any hard currency or cash in the bank. So on the one hand, you'll have economies like the United States or Canada where they have complete control over how much money they print, and their central banks can essentially affect their currencies however they want to make it to balance things out in terms of overspending and underspending. The inverse of this, the European Union, all going off the euro, because their economies are all tied together, they don't have the same flexibility to help things out in a crisis. One of the recent examples of this was the economic crisis in Greece, as their money bottomed out because they were in debt, they weren't able to affect the euro in order to speed things along for a recovery. So modern monetary theory, in terms of federal spending within its own country, it's something like a parent allotting screen time as a currency in their own house, right? If your kids do chores and they're on bed, if they're in bed on time, and you give them more screen time on the TV or the computer during the day, you're not necessarily going to affect your overall the debt of your household. As a parent, you have the ability to affect the screen time allotment through your house any way you see fit in order to get your kids to be more productive. So that's a lot like what modern monetary theory is within its own country. It has to be within a bubble. It is by no means a free pass to print whatever money you want. And this is where responsible citizens like you and myself and people who are interested in how the economy works, we really have to guard against the overspending when it comes to what our government is trying to promise us. Because the problem you'll quickly find yourself in is something called hyperinflation. And that is the scary jargon word of the day, hyperinflation. The most famous case of this is the Weimar Republic in Germany right after World War One. Germany had lost the war, had gone into a bunch of war debt because of the fighting, and then they were also punitively attached a lot more debt to pay off through the countries that actually won the war. So Germany took on a lot of debt after that, and its government, the Weimar Republic, quickly started printing money as fast as they could to try and rebuild its economy. Of course, with too much money in circulation, the value of their currency bottomed out, and before you know it, bread lines were forming because a loaf of bread's costing you $100, which you can't afford anyways. So that's the most recent case of extreme hyperinflation that ruined an economy, and of course led to the rise of Adolf, and you know the rest of that story. So I think it's important for us to keep this all in mind as we're discussing COVID relief packages and how much money is on the table, how big should a stimulus check be, and should we help big companies and small companies? We don't have the ability to spend however much we want. I think in a crisis like this, we're definitely going to spend more. We're going to print more money to get people through this hard time, and that's okay. But when Joe Biden's calling for 1,200 and Donald Trump ups him to 2,000, well, your question is, well, why not 3,000? Why not $5,000 a month to help people along? And the reason is we just can't overspend because there will be long-term consequences. You have to understand that. And don't be fooled by the real socialists out there in the crowd. They're using this whole crisis as a demonstration or as an excuse for further federal spending. Hey, look, we're in a hard time and people are wanting the government to give them money. So clearly socialism works. That's not what this is, right? Our economic problems were brought on by federal governments who locked down their countries, right? Businesses are going under because the government's not letting you do what you need to do to survive. So this isn't a case of a social safety net. This is just kind of reparation for government abuse upon us. If anything, I think this is a great demonstration that we need to be more fiscally conservative when times are good. Relatively speaking, Western civilizations had a couple decades now of relative peace and prosperity. Not since World War II have we had an actual catastrophe on our hands that we've had to deal with on a large scale level. And if we look at the historical process of how the things go, we need to get ready for how this looks. We had World War One in the 1910s, came out of that into the Roaring '20s, and then by the 1930s we had the Great Depression, right? So we have a time of upheaval, we have a time of overflow and prosperity, and then the bubble bursts. The same thing happened again with World War II. We had the baby boomers coming home, and we had what was called the golden age of capitalism in the 50s and 60s, and then all of a sudden by the 1970s we had some pretty dry times economically, especially under Jimmy Carter's presidency. So if we do learn a lesson here, it's that we need to probably spend less when times are good so that we can print money when times are bad. We can't be naive enough to think that things will always be great and we'll always get away with happily ever after. And I'm not approaching this from a completely conservative Republican point of view either. I think both parties right now in the U.S. are overspending for their particular interests. Many people are saying you can't have universal health care for Americans because they can't afford it, but instead they're going to blow the budget on military spending and blowing up the Middle East. Also not a great use of anyone's time or money. Anyways, those are my thoughts on it. on the Corona relief package, on modern monetary theory, and how we need to look after our economies going forward. I'm John with Parking Lot Rebels. If you like this, please like or subscribe. And follow us on Twitter at Parking Lot Rebels, or check us out at www.parkinglotrebels.com. We're here giving you our own thoughts on what's going on. We'll see you next time.